Hey guys, tonight we begin with something painful, poetic, and incredibly strange: the justice system of the Aztec Empire. A civilization known for its pyramids, precision calendars, and yes, blood-soaked rituals, the Aztecs didn't just sacrifice people for religion. They also had a legal system, one filled with punishments that were as creative as they were terrifying. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine stealing food and being dragged naked through the city while chili powder is rubbed into your wounds. Or being forced to inhale smoke until you passed out. All because you cut down the wrong tree. These weren't the acts of a madman. This was Aztec law. And in their world, punishment was both performance and policy. So what were some of the strangest, most brutal, and occasionally hilarious ways the Aztecs kept order? Let's begin. When people think of the Aztec Empire, they often picture heart sacrifices, blood-soaked pyramids, and priests with obsidian knives. Not exactly a civilization known for its warm approach to human resources. But here's the thing. The Aztecs didn't just swing blades at anyone who annoyed them. They had a legal system, and it was surprisingly organized. Sophisticated even. Brutal? Absolutely. But not chaotic. Aztec justice had rules, codes, and a structure that would make your HOA jealous. Laws were written into a code known as the Huehuetlatolli, a set of wise sayings and instructions that covered everything from marriage and market conduct to how not to die painfully in public. These laws were passed down through generations, and while there weren't any leather-bound law books, there were judges, actual, specialized officials who took their jobs very seriously. No powdered wigs, just stern faces and an excellent memory for punishment options. And yes, they had appeals courts. You could argue your case to higher judges, though your chances were slim if the community already saw you as that guy who stole the corn twice. Judges were often priests or elder nobles, people considered wise, experienced, and highly trained in the legal traditions. They weren't above taking bribes, sure, but if you were caught bribing them, you could be executed. So really everyone played the game carefully. What made Aztec justice truly unique was its mix of morality and pageantry. Justice wasn't just served, it was performed. Punishments were designed to teach lessons, not quietly behind closed doors, but loudly, publicly, and often with props. You didn't just pay a fine for a crime, you were shaved, painted, dragged, or symbolically transformed into a warning poster with legs. And here's the most Aztec part. Some punishments changed, depending on your social class. Nobles were held to higher standards, and harsher punishments. A commoner might be fined or flogged. A noble who did the same thing could lose land, titles, or his head. So no, Aztec justice wasn't random. It was sharp, stylish, public, and a little theatrical. And if you broke the law, the empire made sure you never forgot it, and neither did your neighbours. So you've broken a law in the Aztec Empire. Maybe you drank pulque underage. Maybe you stole a basket of maize. Or maybe, and let's hope not, you cut down a sacred tree. Whatever your crime, you're about to meet the Aztec court system. Don't bother calling your lawyer. There aren't any. The Aztec courts were highly structured, but not exactly what you'd call cozy. Think more stone platform surrounded by stern men in feathered cloaks than cozy courtroom drama. The trial would take place publicly, often in a plaza or temple court, and it wasn't designed for theatrics, unless you count the part where someone might be shaved, painted, or whipped in front of a crowd. Cases were typically heard by judges known as tlaxitlan, wise elders or noblemen trained in the laws and customs of the empire. They weren't just randomly assigned. They had to study for years, memorize large sections of law code, and learn how to spot a liar from 10 paces away. You didn't argue with them. unless you really like the sound of public flogging. The accused could defend themselves, and sometimes a family member or elder might speak on their behalf. But let's be honest, unless you were incredibly persuasive or very, very lucky, things probably weren't leaning in your favour. There were witnesses, evidence, and even multiple courts, including a high court and an emperor-level appeal. Yes, you could take your case all the way to the top. But the journey there was rough, and if the emperor decided you were guilty, well, let's just say there wouldn't be much paperwork afterward. One thing you'll notice quickly: the Aztecs didn't believe in dragging things out. No long trials, no years of debate. Judgments came fast, and punishment often came the same day. That's efficiency. Terrifying, skin-peeling efficiency. Also, no jails. Aztec society didn't warehouse criminals. You were either fined, humiliated, enslaved, or executed. And sometimes all four. But you were never forgotten. Aztec courts weren't about legal rights or clever technicalities. They were about moral clarity, social order, and public spectacle. So if you're standing before an Aztec judge, straighten up, speak carefully, and try not to sweat too obviously. They notice that sort of thing. In most cultures, kids who misbehave get a time-out, or maybe a stern lecture. In the Aztec Empire, they got something a little more intense. Meet the chili smoke chamber. Possibly history's most dramatic method of saying, listen to your mother. In Aztec households, obedience wasn't optional. Children were expected to work, listen, respect their elders, and contribute to the home. The idea was simple. Train them early to be good citizens, hard workers, and future warriors or weavers. And if little Cuauhtémoc didn't want to sweep the floor or dared to talk back, he got the chili. The punishment was called tranquil, and it involved placing the disobedient child in a small enclosed space, such as a hut or storage room, where chilies had been thrown onto a fire. As they burned, the room filled with a smoke so intense it made your eyes burn, your throat close up, and your sinuses scream. Think pepper spray, but with spiritual intent. The child wasn't harmed physically, at least not permanently, but the experience was unforgettable. They weren't beaten, bruised, or bloodied. Instead, they were overwhelmed. The sensory overload of chili vapor did the job of several hours of parental yelling in just a few minutes, and the goal wasn't cruelty, it was shame-based conditioning. Once you've coughed up your will to misbehave, you're unlikely to sass your parents again, at least until your voice comes back. Other punishments for children included being pricked with cactus spines, forced to sweep temples in public, or made to carry bundles of firewood beyond their strength. These acts weren't about humiliation for fun. They were rites of correction. And in a society where every person had a social duty, discipline wasn't negotiable. Even noble children weren't spared. In fact, they were held to higher standards. A noble boy who disrespected a teacher or elder could be bound, beaten, or even temporarily enslaved. Not permanently, but enough to make the lessons sting, figuratively and literally. So if you grew up Aztec, rebellion came with real consequences, and probably a few tearful, fiery afternoons spent marinating in chili smoke. Spicy? Yes. Effective? Definitely. And let's face it, no one forgets their first chili sauna. The Aztec Empire had one of the most unforgiving views of theft in the ancient world. Stealing wasn't just a moral failing. It was an attack on the structure of society. Food, tools, cloth, firewood. It all had value, and taking what wasn't yours didn't just offend your neighbour, it offended the gods. And the punishment? Let's just say the Aztecs weren't into subtlety. For first-time offenders, things started reasonably. A thief might be forced to return the stolen goods, make reparations, or be publicly shamed. Maybe a few lashes, maybe a haircut that said, "I steal things." Painful, but survivable. But if you stole again, you entered the realm of enslavement. The Aztecs didn't do prisons. They preferred that you work off your debt, quite literally. Caught a second time, and you might be handed over to the victim as a personal servant. You'd labour in silence, dignity gone, every step reminding you that honesty would have been easier. Now, If you were bold and/or foolish enough to steal a third time, things turned gruesome. Punishment 3 was often ritual skinning, not quick, not clean, and absolutely not private. It was slow, ceremonial, and publicly displayed. This wasn't just about pain, it was about symbolism. The skin was considered a sacred layer, a part of your identity. To remove it was to unmake you in the eyes of the community. Sometimes the skin was removed in strips, other times whole, and it wasn't just thrown away. In religious ceremonies, a priest might even wear the skin for a brief time in honor of the earth goddess, representing rebirth and punishment all in one macabre package. Sound horrifying? It was. And that was the point. This kind of justice wasn't just about the individual. It was about the message. A skinned thief in the market square stopped 1,000 future crimes. It made you think twice before swiping tamales or slipping a jade bead into your tunic. The Aztecs believed in law, in consequence, and in the power of example. And their message was clear. Steal once, we'll warn you. Steal twice, we'll work you. Steal 3 times, you won't be needing your skin. In the Aztec Empire, marriage was serious business. Not just a social contract, but a sacred bond tied to cosmic balance, family honor, and economic alliances. So when someone broke that bond with a little romantic extracurricular activity, the punishment was not divorce court. It was death by blunt object. Let's begin with the basics. Adultery wasn't treated as a private scandal. It was a capital crime, publicly prosecuted and severely punished. And it wasn't just men who got to point fingers. Women could accuse too. But if you were caught? The empire didn't do therapy. If a man was found sleeping with another man's wife, the husband had options, and none of them involved second chances. The most common penalty? Public execution, often by bludgeoning with a stone club, a heavy instrument called a macuahuitl. It was a sword-like weapon embedded with obsidian blades, but for domestic dishonor, the blunt version got the job done, painfully and thoroughly. Sometimes the punishment wasn't left to the courts. In certain cases, the wronged spouse could carry out the sentence personally. Talk about closure. Women caught cheating faced equally grim fates. Death by strangulation, stoning, or being thrown off a cliff were all on the table, depending on the region and the exact nature of the betrayal. Nobles, of course, were held to stricter standards, because when the wealthy cheat, it's not just scandal, it's potential dynastic collapse. And let's not forget the drama. If the affair was exposed publicly, the accused might be paraded through the streets, mocked, shaved, painted, all before meeting their final punishment. Shame was not a side effect. It was part of the sentence. Now, if someone accused you falsely, that was another story. Lying about adultery could get you executed as well. The Aztecs didn't tolerate character assassination unless it came with evidence, and they took witness testimony seriously. So no rumour-mongering for revenge, unless you liked playing with obsidian. At the heart of it all, Aztec marriage was a sacred institution, and violating it wasn't just a moral slip. It was an insult to society, gods, and law. So if you ever wondered whether ancient civilizations cared about monogamy, in the Aztec Empire, the answer was yes, to death. You've heard of being punished for theft, murder, even adultery. But what about cutting down the wrong tree? In the Aztec Empire, some trees weren't just wood with leaves, they were sacred. They represented the gods, the ancestors, or the very balance of nature. And if you, in your infinite wisdom, decided to chop one down for firewood, well, say goodbye to your house, possibly your dignity too. Certain trees, especially those planted near temples, marketplaces, or shrines, were considered protected by divine right. Damaging one was seen as a spiritual offence, not just an act of vandalism. You weren't just hurting nature, you were insulting the cosmic order. The punishment? For a first offence, you might be publicly beaten, often with cactus spines or thorny branches. Yes, They made nature punish you with itself. Poetic justice with a prickly edge. But that wasn't the worst of it. In many cases, you'd also be forced to pay restitution, in the form of goods, labour, or even losing your home. Your property could be confiscated or burned, and in some regions the offending tree cutter was paraded through the town, while villagers hurled insults and occasionally pebbles. The idea wasn't just to hurt you physically, it was to let everyone know. This idiot messed with the gods' landscaping, and if you were a repeat offender, you might be enslaved, especially if the tree you harmed was near a sacred site. Because apparently, if you couldn't respect the roots of a tree, you didn't deserve roots of your own. To modern ears, it might sound absurd, punished for trimming a branch. But to the Aztecs, this was serious. Nature wasn't passive. It was alive, sacred, and deeply connected to the divine. Trees, rivers, mountains, they weren't resources. They were relatives, and harming them without permission was like slapping your grandmother and hoping nobody noticed. So yes, if you lived in the Aztec Empire, you needed to know your botany laws. That tree outside your neighbour's house? Better ask first. The shady one in the marketplace? Definitely don't touch it, because in this world, ignorance isn't bliss. It's just flammable property and bruises from thorns. In most cultures, teenage drinking ends with a lecture, a bad hangover, or a very awkward ride home with your parents. In the Aztec Empire, it ended with execution. Let's get one thing straight. The Aztecs weren't anti-alcohol. They had a beloved sacred drink called pulque, made from the fermented sap of the maguey plant. It was frothy, slightly sour, and loaded with ritual significance. Pulque was used in religious ceremonies, festivals, and even funeral rites. For adults, especially elders and priests, it was considered medicinal and divine. But if you were a teenager, one sip was a death sentence. Young Aztecs were expected to be disciplined, respectful, and absolutely sober. Pulque was for those who had earned it, through battle, age, or wisdom. Youth was a time for learning, not partying, and drunkenness among teens wasn't just frowned upon, it was seen as moral collapse. So if a teenager was caught drinking, the punishment was swift and harsh. A first-time offender might be shaved bald, a mark of shame. Sometimes they were paraded naked through the streets, while villagers hurled insults or trash. A mobile reminder that good choices are better than fermented ones. But for repeat offenders, the sentence escalated fast. Execution by strangulation or beating, often in public. The method wasn't designed for drama, it was designed for memory. One teenager hanging from a pole was all it took to sober up the rest of the neighbourhood for a generation. Even noble-born youth weren't spared. In fact, they were held to stricter standards. A prince caught drinking might face ritual humiliation in the royal court, or be sent to live in a cold, remote temple as punishment. The message, privilege doesn't excuse foolishness. Why so severe? Because the Aztecs saw drunkenness as a kind of spiritual rot, a gateway to laziness, disrespect, and disobedience. And in a civilization that depended on order, discipline, and cosmic balance, a tipsy teen was a ticking time bomb. So next time you imagine a wild Aztec party, remember, unless you were old, high-ranking, or involved in a funeral, your pulque cup stayed dry. Otherwise, your throat wouldn't. In the Aztec Empire, work wasn't just a chore. It was a virtue, a sacred expectation, a civic duty written into the social fabric. Everyone, from commoner to noble, had a role to play in the great cosmic machine. So what happened if you didn't pull your weight? Let's put it this way. You'd be working again very soon, just not by choice. Laziness, idleness, slacking off, these weren't treated as personality quirks. They were considered offences against the gods, particularly Tlaloc, god of rain and agriculture, and Tezcatlipoca, who kept a sharp eye on moral behaviour. The gods didn't give you good harvests, so you could nap in the shade. If you disrespected the order of labour, the Aztecs made sure you'd feel the consequences. If a man refused to work, refused to help his family, or consistently ignored his civic duties, he could be dragged into the marketplace and publicly shamed. His head might be shaved, his clothes replaced with rags. In some cases, he'd be forced to wear rotten garments or carry bundles of firewood through the town while people shouted things like, "Behold the man who does nothing." But that was the gentle version. Repeat offenders might be beaten with rods, tied to a post, or, if their laziness was seen as willful defiance, sold into slavery. Not forever, but long enough to learn the lesson. You're either useful or you're used. Even noble-born youths were monitored closely. If a young man of high rank refused to train for war or skipped temple duties, his family could request that he be sent to a house of youth correction, which sounds like summer camp, but was really more like a military boot camp with cactus punishments. Laziness among women wasn't ignored either. Though women had different duties, grinding maize, weaving, tending the home, they too could be shamed for neglect. Mothers were expected to raise hard-working children, not ones who lounged around chewing maize husks. The Aztec belief was simple. Idleness disrupts harmony. A lazy person risks their family's well-being, their community's balance, and the favour of the gods. So if you were planning to lounge around the Chinampa and skip your corn harvesting chores, better start running. Because the punishment wouldn't be quiet, and it wouldn't be optional. In the bustling heart of the Aztec Empire, the Tianquistli, or marketplace, everything was negotiable, except honesty. Selling rotten fruit, watered-down pulque, or fake obsidian was not just bad business. It was criminal behaviour, and the Aztecs had zero tolerance for marketplace mischief. You weren't just breaking a rule. You were betraying the gods who blessed commerce, agriculture, and fair exchange. Every seller, whether hawking tamales or trading jade, was expected to abide by strict ethical codes. Markets were sacred spaces, often overseen by special officials called pochtacatlatok, market judges or inspectors. Their job: walk among the stalls, listen for complaints, and catch people slipping pebbles into their chili powder. If you got caught selling spoiled goods, punishment was swift and very public. A first-time offence might involve public shaming, your stall overturned, your produce scattered, and your hands bound for everyone to see. Shoppers would walk past and spit insults like, "There goes the liar with wormy avocados." Selling something falsely advertised, say dyed feathers labelled as sacred Quetzal plumes, was even worse. That could get you beaten, fined, or in extreme cases, banished from the market altogether. And in a society where markets were your lifeline, banishment wasn't a time-out. It was economic death. Repeat offenders could be enslaved or branded, marked so future buyers knew never to trust your mangoes again. If your fraud caused real harm, like selling toxic herbs as medicine, you might even face execution, especially if the victim was of noble status. It wasn't just about punishment, it was about protecting trust. The market was where communities met, families survived, and tribute flowed. If buyers stopped trusting sellers, the entire structure began to crumble. That couldn't be allowed. Even sellers of sacred goods, incense, ceremonial textiles, or idols, were watched closely. If a temple merchant was caught selling low-quality items for high tribute prices, they weren't just scamming people. They were cheating the gods. And the gods didn't give refunds. They gave plagues. So if you thought you could hustle your way through the market with a painted corn cob and a charming smile, think again. Because in Tenochtitlan, the phrase buyer beware came with a very sharp edge. If you ever found yourself standing in an Aztec courtroom, surrounded by elders in feathered cloaks and facing judgment under the piercing gaze of a priest judge, here's one golden rule. Do not lie. Seriously. Don't embellish. Don't misremember. And absolutely don't invent your own version of the truth. Because in the Aztec Empire, false testimony wasn't just unethical, it was deadly. The Aztecs held truth as a sacred principle, not just a courtroom courtesy. Telling the truth meant upholding order, harmony, and divine balance. Lies, on the other hand, corrupted the social structure and offended the gods, especially Tezcatlipoca, the god of night, judgment, and truth. He didn't appreciate your creative storytelling. Court trials depended heavily on witness testimony. There were no security cameras, no forensic labs, just your word against someone else's. And that word carried serious weight. So when you lied in court, you weren't just tipping the scales. You were potentially sending someone to their death or enslavement unjustly. The punishment for perjury? Execution, often by strangulation, stoning, or being clubbed to death, depending on the region and the severity of your deceit. If the lie was proven after the trial, and your false words led to someone else's suffering, you'd often be made to suffer the same fate you caused them. It was poetic justice, with sharp edges. Even lesser lies came with serious consequences. Public beatings, banishment, or ritual humiliation could follow. You might be painted black, the colour of deceit, or shaved bald and paraded through the market with a sign around your neck reading something like, "Talks too much, tells too little truth." False accusers weren't just punished for lying. They were seen as threats to society itself, willing to manipulate justice, harm others, and risk divine anger for selfish gain. Aztec law wasn't about technicalities, it was about moral clarity. And in their eyes, truth was sacred, binding, and non-negotiable. So if you ever stood in the plaza, accused of a crime, and thought a small fib might get you off the hook, remember, in the Aztec Empire, the truth could set you free, but a lie, it could bury you. The Aztecs believed in second chances, just not very many of them. Their legal system was harsh, but not heartless. A first offence might earn you a warning, a fine, or a good public flogging to help you remember the lesson. A second time, and you'd face something more intense, maybe public humiliation, servitude, or the loss of your possessions. But a third offence, that's when things got serious, like ritual execution serious. To the Aztecs, repeated crimes weren't just a nuisance, they were proof that you had refused to live in balance. And balance, in Aztec worldview, was everything. The crops grew because society worked. The sun rose because people obeyed their roles. So when someone broke the law again and again, they weren't just annoying, they were a threat to cosmic order. Let's say you were a thief. First time, you return the goods. Second time, you're enslaved. Third time, you're skinned. Slowly, in public, with the full backing of the law and, very possibly, the neighbourhood. Or maybe you lied in court. Again. The punishment wasn't just harsher than before. It was symbolic. Your repeated dishonesty made you inhuman in the eyes of society. And what happens to those who lose their humanity? They become examples, warnings, cautionary tales. And it wasn't just about physical punishment. Repeat offenders could lose their legal protection entirely. That meant anyone could harm, enslave, or publicly shame you. And you had no legal recourse. You weren't exiled. You weren't imprisoned. You were unpersoned. In some cases, a repeat offender could be permanently banished from the market, the village, or even their own family. Imagine being spiritually erased, not because the gods abandoned you, but because you abandoned the social contract one too many times. To the Aztecs, lawbreakers weren't inherently evil. They were correctable. But repeat offenders were something worse, unwilling to learn. And in a society where justice was public, swift and divine, the state didn't waste time on those who refused to be rehabilitated. So if you got caught once, you were lucky. Twice, you were warned. But if you stood in that courtroom a third time, you were already gone. In modern justice systems, punishment often happens behind closed doors, courtrooms, jail cells, private hearings. But in the Aztec Empire, justice was street theatre. Punishment wasn't just meant for the person who broke the law. It was designed to educate everyone else. The Aztecs believed that fear and shame were tools just as important as clubs and cactus whips. If someone saw your humiliation, they'd remember it long after the pain faded. And they'd think twice before stealing that tamale. That's why almost all punishments, from flogging to execution, were carried out in the open, usually in the center of the community, the plaza, the marketplace, or outside temples. These were the places where people gathered to trade, pray, and socialize, perfect for teaching lessons in full view of your friends, family, and enemies. Imagine this. You're caught lying or stealing. You're dragged to the plaza. A crowd gathers. Your clothes are torn. Your head might be shaved. You're painted with black soot to mark your shame. And then, the punishment begins. A beating, a binding, maybe a good chili smoking in a hut if you're still young and reckless. Children who disrespected elders might be made to carry heavy bundles of wood, barefoot, across town. Lazy workers could be paraded with signs around their necks. Adulterers could be stoned or strangled before a sea of silent, or not-so-silent, onlookers. Public punishment wasn't random cruelty. It was a ritual of memory. The Aztecs understood human psychology. Pain fades, embarrassment echoes, and that echo kept society in line. There were no prison systems, no lifelong incarcerations. The point wasn't to disappear wrongdoers, it was to transform them, or destroy them, in full view. Even executions were spectacles. A thief might be flayed, not in some dark back room, but in the square where he once sold stolen goods. His punishment became a living parable for every passerby. In Aztec law, privacy was for the innocent. The guilty were meant to be seen, heard, and remembered, not just for what they did, but for what happened next. Because in this world, your real sentence wasn't just death or pain, it was becoming the lesson. In the Aztec Empire, punishment wasn't just about what you felt, it was about what you represented. It wasn't enough for you to hurt. You had to be seen, interpreted, and above all, understood. Because justice in Tenochtitlan wasn't just a legal process, it was a performance. And you? You were the unfortunate star. Let's say you stole something. Food, tools, clothing. If it was your first offence, maybe you weren't beaten. Instead, your head was shaved, your body painted with black soot, and you were paraded around in humiliating clothes. Torn, oversized tunics or rags tied in knots that made you look ridiculous. Not physically painful, but symbolically devastating. Or say you lied in court. You might have your lips stained with charcoal to mark your deceit. Everyone would see it. Everyone would know. It didn't matter if you told the truth later. The stain told its own story. Even colours had meaning. Black was associated with deceit and shame. Red might mark a serious offence. Striped or dyed clothing could be reserved for public punishments. The Aztecs understood that the human eye doesn't forget what it's been trained to fear. Noble offenders were treated no differently. In fact, worse. A noble child caught drunk might be dressed as a commoner and forced to sweep temple floors, a clear inversion of his status. To an Aztec audience, that image was powerful. This is what happens when the privileged dishonor their role. Even punishment tools were symbolic. Being beaten with cactus spines was not just about the pain. It reflected the natural world's judgment. Carrying heavy bundles of firewood symbolized the burden of guilt. A shaved head didn't just look odd. It meant you'd been stripped of social dignity. The message: crime wasn't a private mistake. It was a public rupture, a disruption in the sacred flow of order. And to heal it, society needed not just consequences, but images that endured, living reminders that law and morality were deeply intertwined. In short, Aztec punishment was a play, a visual story designed to be retold through gossip, song, and frightened memory. You weren't just a criminal, you were now a symbol. In most societies, punishment often ends behind bars. Time served, walls built, a sentence measured in months or years. But in the Aztec Empire, there were no prisons. Why? Because the Aztecs didn't believe in storing problems. They solved them. Quickly, publicly, and very often, permanently. To the Aztec mind, punishment wasn't about removing someone from society. It was about returning them to order, or removing them from the world altogether. There was no need to feed a prisoner, build a jail, or fund a guard system. Time wasn't the consequence. Shame, pain, or death was. If you stole, you might be enslaved and forced to work off your crime. But you didn't disappear. You remained in society as a cautionary example. If you lied, you wore the symbols of deceit on your body. If you committed a serious offence, the punishment came swiftly, with the community watching and the gods invoked. And if you couldn't be corrected, if you were a repeat offender, a danger to others, or simply defiant, then your story ended. Not behind a door with iron bars, but in the marketplace, the plaza, or the temple steps, with no need for parole. Even noble prisoners, such as captured enemy rulers or high-ranking criminals, weren't jailed. They were housed temporarily in ritual captivity, treated according to status until their scheduled execution or sacrifice. Their time wasn't served. It was counted down. There were, however, small holding rooms, not prisons, but places to detain someone briefly before their punishment. These were sparse, guarded by warriors, and not used for rehabilitation. You weren't sent there to change. You were sent there to wait. This system worked because Aztec law relied on immediacy and visibility. Delayed punishment weakened its impact. Invisible punishment, like imprisonment, robbed society of the lesson. And in Aztec eyes, the lesson was the most important part. So while other civilizations built towers to hide their criminals, the Aztecs built rituals to remind you. Break the order, and the consequences will be swift, public, and unforgettable. Because in this empire, they didn't need bars. They had balance. By now, you've probably noticed, the Aztec Empire didn't believe in second chances for long. Their punishments were swift, symbolic, and often painful, and that was exactly the point. Because to the Aztecs, the purpose of justice wasn't rehabilitation. It was remembrance. Every punishment, whether it was a chili smoke sauna, a cactus whipping, or being flayed in the plaza, was designed to etch the crime into collective memory. For the offender, for the bystanders, for the entire community. A culture without prisons relied on something much stronger: fear, shame, and the kind of storytelling that starts with, "You'll never believe what I saw in the marketplace today." And that's what made the Aztec legal system so effective and so terrifying. It forced people to remember, because if you didn't, you might not live long enough to forget. The entire society was wired for moral clarity. Children were taught early that wrongdoing brought not only pain, but spectacle. Adults knew that crime wasn't just a personal failure. It was a cosmic imbalance. The gods didn't want lengthy court cases. They wanted action, and the Empire delivered. But here's the twist. For all its brutality, the system worked, at least for them. Social order was maintained. Markets ran smoothly. Children were respectful. Priests weren't pickpocketed during ceremonies. And if you ever thought about breaking a rule, all it took was one glance at the guy with the shaved head and soot-smeared face limping past you, and suddenly you remembered the rules quite clearly. The Aztecs didn't just punish, they performed morality. Every crime was an opportunity for education. Every consequence was theatre. You learned not by reading a scroll, but by witnessing a punishment you never wanted to experience yourself. And if you couldn't learn, well, the system had room for that too. In a society without long-term prisons, non-learners were recycled into warnings. You either remembered the rules, or you didn't survive long enough to break them again. That was Aztec justice, swift, symbolic, and unforgettable in all the ways that mattered. Before she was the scourge of Roman merchants and the symbol of seaborne defiance, Chota was a woman navigating the brutal politics of a rising Illyrian kingdom. She didn't inherit her throne in peace. She married it. As the wife of King Agron of the RDA tribe, one of the most powerful Illyrian coalitions on the eastern Adriatic coast, Tuta entered a world dominated by warlords, smugglers, and maritime raiders. Agron was a formidable king, known for his military ambition and expansionist campaigns. Under his leadership, Illyria became a naval force to be feared. But in 231 BCE, his sudden death from illness or perhaps a drinking binge, depending on which ancient gossip you believe, left the throne in a precarious position. And Tutor stepped in, not as a grieving widow, but as the regent commander for her underage stepson, Pinnes. This was not a ceremonial position. Tutor didn't sit behind silk curtains waiting for advisors. She took the reins of power, and more importantly, of the navy. Her rule came at a time when piracy wasn't just tolerated. It was practically a national pastime. Illyrian pirates weren't criminals in the eyes of their own people. They were the backbone of the local economy. They raided merchant ships, demanded tribute, and controlled key trade routes through the Adriatic and Ionian seas. Under Tutor's regency, piracy didn't just continue, it expanded. She encouraged it, licensed it, and defended it fiercely. To her, it was a legitimate form of warfare, and to many Illyrians, it was an honourable profession. Tutor knew what she was doing. In a world where Athens had faded and Rome hadn't yet fully reached across the sea, she saw a vacuum, and she filled it with Illyrian sails. But while she may have had the Adriatic under control, her boldness would soon provoke a power that didn't take kindly to maritime interference. Rome, slowly but confidently expanding its reach, was watching. And as Illyrian piracy bled into Roman trade routes, Tutor's reign would no longer be a local affair. It would become an international problem, one the Romans decided needed a very permanent solution. The Queen of the Rocks and Sea had stirred a giant. Tutor's pirates weren't just raiding isolated merchant boats. They were striking at Roman convoys, demanding tribute from Greek cities under Roman protection, and even plundering ports along the western coastline. To Rome, this wasn't piracy. It was an insult. And Romans were not famous for letting insults go unanswered. By 230 BCE, Roman senators had had enough. The Senate dispatched a formal diplomatic mission to Tutor's court, a warning cloaked in diplomacy, but with a blade behind the back. The lead ambassador, a Roman named Lucius Coruncanius, was known for his bluntness. His instructions were clear. Tell the Illyrian queen to stop the piracy, or Rome would take action. When the delegation arrived, they were likely met in Scodra, Tutor's capital. Imagine the scene. Marble columns, Illyrian guards with crested helmets, and a queen seated not in fear, but in full command. Tutor welcomed them. But when they delivered Rome's message, her response was frosty. She gave them the kind of answer only a monarch with salt in her veins would give. In her own words, as later recorded by Roman historians, she claimed that Illyrian kings had always permitted their subjects to make a living however they pleased, including through piracy. She essentially told Rome that what happened at sea was out of her hands. It wasn't exactly the answer Rome wanted. And then came a fatal mistake. One of the Roman envoys, perhaps emboldened by Roman pride or just plain arrogance, insulted Tutor, publicly. He accused her of acting like a woman, implying she was weak, emotional, and unfit to rule. Whether it was sexism, diplomacy, or sheer stupidity, that remark cost him his life. Not long after, he was assassinated on Tutor's orders, a decision that would echo all the way back to the marble floors of the Roman Senate. Rome erupted in outrage. Killing a Roman envoy was more than a diplomatic breach. It was an act of war. And not just any war. This would be Rome's first military campaign across the Adriatic, the beginning of its expansion into the eastern Mediterranean. Tutor had made her move. Whether out of pride, policy, or sheer fury, she had crossed the line. Now Rome was coming, not with envoys but with legions. The Queen had awakened the Republic's wrath, and there would be no more warnings. Tutor likely knew that Rome's retaliation wouldn't be small, but even she might have underestimated the scale and speed of the Roman response. In 229 BCE, barely a year after the assassination of their envoy, Rome launched its first ever military campaign across the Adriatic Sea. It was swift, organised, and chillingly efficient. 2 consuls were dispatched with over 200 ships, a fleet that dwarfed anything Illyria had seen before. This wasn't a typical raid or a border skirmish. It was a full-scale invasion. Tuta, still ruling as regent and supreme commander of the navy, prepared her forces as best she could. But Illyria, for all its maritime skill and fierce warriors, was a patchwork of tribes. Rome was a machine. The Romans didn't waste time. They first targeted the Greek city-states along the coast that had been bullied or occupied by Illyrian forces. Corcyra, modern-day Corfu, which had been seized by Illyrian pirates, was liberated by the Romans and turned into a naval base. Apollonia and Epidamnus quickly fell in line with Roman protection. The message was clear. The Adriatic would no longer be Illyria's playground. But Tuta wasn't hiding. She sent her fleet out to defend the coasts, and Illyrian pirates continued to strike where they could. Yet the tide was shifting. For every raid they launched, the Romans captured a stronghold. The Roman navy, though new to the eastern waters, was learning fast, and they were ruthless. As Rome advanced, more Illyrian allies began to surrender. Cities that once looked to Tuta for leadership now opened their gates to Rome, hoping for leniency. The loyalty she once inspired as the pirate queen began to fray, especially as Roman soldiers advanced inland, forcing a choice: stand with a besieged queen, or survive. By the end of the year, Roman troops were within striking distance of Scodra, Tuta's capital. What had started as a defiant act, a queen protecting her people's way of life, was rapidly becoming a siege. Tuta now faced a decision no monarch ever wants to make: fight until the bitter end and risk annihilation, or bow to a foreign power. The queen who had ruled the waves now found herself surrounded by enemy sails. Her fate, and Illyria's, hung in the balance. Forfo. With Roman forces closing in on Scodra and her allies collapsing one by one, Tuta's once mighty influence began to shrink like a receding tide. Her network of coastal strongholds, vital for resupplying ships and launching raids, was crumbling under Roman pressure. The Adriatic Sea, once an Illyrian dominion, now bristled with Roman warships. The Queen of the Sea had lost her sea, but Tuta was no fool. She may have ruled with defiance, but she knew when to bend, especially when survival was on the line. In 228 BCE, facing overwhelming odds, she did what no one expected the proud pirate queen to do. She sued for peace. The negotiations were humiliating by design. Rome wanted to make an example of her. They demanded she give up most of the Illyrian coastline, surrender key forts, and, most painfully, abandon her beloved navy. Tuta was allowed to rule only a small inland portion of her former kingdom. And even there, she had to promise never to sail beyond a narrow stretch of coastline with more than 2 unarmed ships. 2 unarmed ships. For a woman who once commanded fleets, it was a symbolic castration. The sea was no longer hers. The title of pirate queen had been forcibly retired, and the Adriatic now answered to Rome. But even in surrender, Tuta wasn't completely broken. Though her political power was gutted and her military reach clipped, she retained her title and remained regent for a short time. Her ability to survive the storm, quite literally, showed the cunning and realism that had defined her rule. In a world where other rebellious rulers were often executed or dragged in chains through Roman triumphs, Tuta was spared. Perhaps Rome respected her tenacity, or perhaps they feared turning her into a martyr. Still, her influence faded quickly. Soon after the peace agreement, Tuta disappears from historical record. Her stepson Pinnes would eventually rule in name, though always under Roman oversight. Tuta, once a queen with command over waves and warriors, faded into silence. But she was far from forgotten. In Roman memory, she was the first to challenge them on the open sea. And in Illyrian legend, she remained a symbol of resistance. a woman who dared to defy a rising empire and nearly got away with it. Though Teuto's rule ended in surrender, her legacy laid the foundation for one of the most critical transitions in Mediterranean history: the birth of Rome as a naval superpower. Ironically, it was her defiance that forced Rome to evolve. Before Teuta, Rome had been primarily a land-based power. Its military strength came from its legions, its politics from the landowning elite, and its focus was always centered on the Italian peninsula. The sea? That was for traders and Greeks, or for pirates like the Illyrians. But Teuta changed that. The First Illyrian War, sparked by her bold resistance and the assassination of a Roman envoy, was Rome's first serious engagement across the Adriatic. It required building fleets, mastering sea routes, and learning how to occupy and administer coastal cities. This wasn't just a temporary expedition. It was an initiation. Teuta didn't just anger Rome, she forced them to expand. And Rome took notes. They didn't dismantle the pirate system and leave. They replaced it. After their victory, Rome established protectorates along the Illyrian and Greek coastlines, securing trade routes that had previously been at the mercy of Teuta's raiders. They installed friendly rulers, collected tribute, and built a lasting presence. The Adriatic, once Illyrian blue, now shimmered with Roman sails. It's easy to overlook the significance of this. But without Teuta, without the crisis she caused, Rome might never have become a naval empire so early. She was, unintentionally, a catalyst. Her resistance prompted innovation, her aggression triggered a transformation, and her fall marked a strategic shift in Roman foreign policy, from guarding borders to crossing them. Of course, she didn't do this willingly. Teuta's goals were never to teach Rome how to build an empire. She was fighting to protect her people's independence, to legitimize Illyrian seafaring, and to hold on to her authority in a man's world. But like so many historical figures caught in the gears of empire, her legacy would be written by her enemies. Still, one can't help but wonder, had Teuta not challenged Rome? Would the Republic have crossed the Adriatic so soon? Or would it have remained a landlocked empire for another generation? Either way, Teuta's actions had changed the map, and history, ever the trickster, remembers even reluctant revolutionaries. Teuta's story isn't just about pirates and power struggles, it's also about gender. She wasn't simply a ruler. She was a woman ruling in a brutal, male-dominated world, where command was usually earned on horseback or through bloodline, preferably both. And yet, here was Teuta, commanding fleets, making diplomatic decisions, executing envoys, and triggering international wars. The ancient world wasn't kind to female leaders. When women ruled, chroniclers, especially Roman and Greek, often resorted to caricature. Cleopatra was seductive, Boudica was wild, and Teuta, she was dangerous and irrational, at least according to Roman historians. Take Polybius, for example. He describes Teuta as a woman with a natural weakness of the sex. That line alone tells you what she was up against. Roman writers simply couldn't accept that a woman had provoked their republic into war and then held her ground for more than a year, so they chalked it up to female emotion, not political savvy. But let's cut through the ancient propaganda. Teuta didn't rise to power by seduction or scandal. She did it through strategy and survival. She inherited a fragile throne after her husband's death and managed to maintain it in the middle of political chaos. She didn't inherit peace. She inherited piracy, tribal rivalries, and hostile neighbours. And she wielded those elements like weapons. Was she ruthless? Probably. But so were most rulers of the time. Her execution of the Roman envoy wasn't an act of hysteria. It was a calculated, if risky, political message. She was defending Illyrian sovereignty the only way she knew how, by force. And consider this, Teuta wasn't overthrown by her people. She wasn't betrayed in a coup or murdered in palace intrigue. She lost because Rome had overwhelming force. That's it. Her people didn't rise against her. In fact, some of her followers resisted Rome long after she surrendered. Teuta's reign, short as it was, carved her name into a world that rarely made room for women in power. She stood toe-to-toe with the mightiest republic of the time and forced them to take her seriously, even if their historians tried to write her off. She was a queen in war, a ruler in crisis, and a woman who made the ancient world nervous. Though her reign ended in a humbled peace, Tuta's story refused to vanish beneath the waves. Centuries after her last ship was grounded and her voice fell silent, legend still whispered her name along the Adriatic coast. In Illyria, her image transformed from that of a defeated regent into something far more enduring, a symbol of national pride, resistance, and feminine authority. In Albanian folklore especially, Tuta became more than a queen. She was the defiant matriarch of a people, standing alone against the rising tide of foreign domination. Her name was passed down not through dusty treaties, but in the oral histories of shepherds and sailors. Statues of her now stand in modern Albania and Montenegro, bronze reminders that some rulers outlive their empires. And what an empire it was! Illyria may never have rivaled Rome in size or infrastructure, but under Tuta's leadership, it held dominion over key sea lanes and coastal cities. She ruled during one of the last periods when Illyrian identity remained politically independent. After her fall, Rome began a slow, relentless assimilation of Illyrian culture, language, and governance. Tuta's surrender marked not just the end of a war, it marked the beginning of the end for Illyrian sovereignty. But while Rome buried her kingdom under provinces and prefectures, Tuta's memory survived. Her reign, brief though it was, became a rallying point for future generations seeking inspiration. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as Balkan nationalism surged and countries like Albania began to forge new identities from ancient roots, Tuta was revived not as a tragic figure, but as a hero. Textbooks praised her courage. Streets and schools bore her name. She wasn't just a queen anymore. She was an ancestor of defiance. Even in modern scholarship, her story continues to provoke debate. Was she a reckless pirate, or a pragmatic leader forced to embrace piracy as state policy? Was she a tyrant, or a woman backed into a corner by the death of her husband and the ambitions of an empire? Whatever the truth, Tuta occupies a rare space in ancient history, a woman who refused to apologize for her power, and whose decisions, for better or worse, reshaped an entire sea. Her ships may have been scuttled, but her legend, it still sails. Over time, Tuta's historical reality blurred into something mythic, a figure half-draped in truth, half-draped in legend. And it's easy to see why. A queen ruling a coastal kingdom, commanding pirates, defying Rome, and vanishing from history without a clear end. That's the stuff legends are made of. In coastal towns like Kotor and Ulkinj, stories are still told of a queen who once ruled from a towering castle by the sea. Locals will point to crumbling ruins and say, that was Tuta's stronghold, even when archaeology offers little proof. She is said to have thrown herself from cliffs to avoid Roman capture, to have hidden treasure in secret island caves, and to have cursed the waters that betrayed her. None of it can be confirmed, but none of it has ever really needed to be. Because Tuta wasn't just a person anymore. She became a symbol, and symbols are immune to conquest. Even the sea seems to echo with her presence. The name Queen Tuta is engraved on modern cruise ships, hotels, and cultural festivals. Writers in the Romantic era painted her as a tragic heroine, while modern feminists in the Balkans praise her as an early icon of female leadership. Albania in particular has embraced her fully. Statues of Tuta, often depicted with windswept hair and a sword at her side, now grace public squares. Schoolchildren learn her name alongside Skanderbegs. And yet, the real Tuta, the woman behind the myth, remains elusive. We don't know how she died. We don't know whether she ever regretted challenging Rome. We don't even know what she looked like. Her image was crafted by others, often her enemies, and later reshaped by those who needed her as a legend. But maybe that's the mark of true influence, when your story refuses to obey history books. Tuta may have ruled for just a handful of years, but her shadow stretches centuries. She lives on in poems, place names, and whispered tales across the Adriatic coast. The Roman Empire that once tried to erase her is gone, reduced to ruins and textbooks. But Tutor, she still sails in memory. The pirate queen became something greater, immortal. Today, Tutor's name resonates far beyond the annals of ancient history. Her story has been adopted, adapted, and echoed in ways she could never have imagined, not just as a historical curiosity, but as a cultural and national icon. In Albania, Montenegro, and across the Western Balkans, she represents something vital: the fierce independence of a people who refused to be swallowed by empires. Her story speaks loudly in a region that has known centuries of occupation, division, and struggle. For Albanians especially, Teuta has become more than a queen. She's a symbol of national identity. Her legacy has been woven into the cultural revival movements of the 19th and 20th centuries, fueling resistance to foreign domination and inspiring pride in a pre-Roman Illyrian heritage. In a world where borders have shifted countless times, where languages and loyalties have blurred, Teuta is a constant, rooted in stone, salt, and defiance. Her name is found everywhere, from naval vessels and passenger ferries to sports teams, businesses, and even a women's football club. Schools teach her as a national hero. Statues of Teuta, sword in hand and gaze, set on the horizon, overlook harbours once dominated by her fleet. She has become the Adriatic's eternal guardian, a queen not just of the past, but of the cultural present. Her relevance doesn't stop at borders. In the broader conversation about women in leadership, Teuta has become an ancient case study. Her story offers a rare glimpse into female command in a time and place where that was almost unheard of. She challenges modern assumptions about gender and power in the ancient world. Her name is now cited alongside Cleopatra, Boudica, and Zenobia, women who dared to govern in a man's world and left an empire trembling in their wake. And perhaps that's the most remarkable part, that a woman so poorly documented by her contemporaries, remembered mostly through the insults of Roman writers, now stands tall as a figure of empowerment, sovereignty, and bold resistance. Teuta ruled for only a few stormy years, but her name has weathered centuries, and in every port that still remembers her, every story whispered to a child about the queen who defied Rome, Teuta sails on, not in warships, but in memory. The sea was her kingdom, and the story her lasting throne. 1803, the United States pulled off one of the most astonishing real estate deals in history. With the stroke of a pen and the exchange of $15 million, President Thomas Jefferson bought a colossal piece of land from France, the Louisiana Territory. This wasn't a few acres outside New Orleans. This was over 800,000 square miles of uncharted wilderness, stretching from the Mississippi River all the way to the Rocky Mountains and beyond. Jefferson was thrilled. The land would ensure room for westward expansion and secure control over vital trade routes. But there was one small problem. Nobody really knew what was out there. Maps were vague. Rumours swirled about giant mountains, woolly mammoths, a mythical northwest passage to Asia, and river systems that could either carry you to the Pacific or nowhere at all. Jefferson needed answers, and fast. He wanted to turn that blank map into something tangible, something real. So, he devised a plan. Send a small, elite team west to explore the new territory, chart its geography, establish relations with native tribes, and ideally, find a direct water route to the Pacific Ocean. For this unprecedented task, Jefferson turned to Meriwether Lewis, his personal secretary, a former army captain, and someone with an insatiable curiosity for science and nature. Lewis, in turn, chose William Clark, an old friend, military veteran, and skilled outdoorsman, to co-lead the journey. The pair had different personalities. Lewis was introspective and intense, while Clark was steady, practical, and social. But together, they balanced each other perfectly. Their mission was to gather information, not to conquer. They were to take notes on everything, animals, plants, rivers, rocks, and languages. They were diplomats, naturalists, and explorers rolled into one. But let's be clear, this was not a stroll through the woods. The expedition would carry them through untamed rivers, dense forests, scorching plains, and snowy mountains. There were no supply stations, no GPS, no lifelines, just handwritten journals, iron determination, and the hope that the Pacific lay somewhere out there in the fog of the West. Thus, the stage was set. A young nation had bought a vast mystery, and two men were about to step into it, armed with nothing but their courage and a mandate from the president. Before they could step into the wilderness, Lewis and Clark needed a team, and not just any band of travellers. They needed men who could row upstream for weeks, hunt their own food, repair broken equipment, fight if needed, and get along in close quarters with no privacy for years. In short, men tough enough to survive anything. This elite group would be known as the Corps of Discovery. In the winter of 1803-1804, the recruitment began. Lewis and Clark set up camp at Camp Dubois, just north of St. Louis, on the eastern side of the Mississippi River. It would serve as their training ground and staging area. They recruited primarily from military outposts, hardy frontiersmen, skilled riflemen, and disciplined soldiers. Most were in their 20s, single, and eager for adventure. Among them were men like George Drouillard, a master tracker and interpreter, and John Ordway, a strict but capable sergeant who helped enforce discipline. Each recruit swore an oath to the expedition. This wasn't just a scouting party. It was an arm of the US government, carrying the hopes of a growing nation. Lewis and Clark would lead, but every man had a role to play. Blacksmiths, carpenters, hunters, cooks, even musicians were included to help boost morale. Supplies were no less essential. The crew loaded up a custom-built keelboat, complete with a sail, oars, and a cabin. They packed trade goods to offer native tribes, beads, knives, mirrors, peace medals with Jefferson's image, as well as medical kits, scientific instruments, muskets, gunpowder, and over 200 pounds of ink and paper for journals. The men drilled every day through the winter. They practiced rowing, sailing, portaging, and marksmanship. They learned how to survive together, how to follow orders, and how to trust their captains. Discipline was strict. Desertion could mean flogging, but the unity they forged would become their greatest weapon on the journey ahead. By May of 1804, the Corps was ready. Over 40 men strong, they set off up the Missouri River, rowing against the current into a land few Americans had ever seen. It was the beginning of a journey that would take them over mountains, through tribal nations, and all the way to the Pacific, or so they hoped. On May 14, 1804, the Corps of Discovery officially departed from Camp Dubois and began rowing up the Missouri River, the longest river in North America. For the men on board, it was the start of something legendary, though they had no idea how long it would last or what they would face. The terrain ahead was uncharted. The maps were blank. Everything was guesswork. The first stretch of the expedition was grueling. The Missouri's strong current worked against them. Each day meant hours of back-breaking effort, pulling ropes from the riverbanks, pushing poles into the riverbed, or hoisting sails when the wind cooperated. There were sandbars, submerged logs, swarms of mosquitoes, and sweltering summer heat. But even in those early days, Lewis and Clark made it clear that this was not just a voyage. It was a scientific expedition. Every evening, they meticulously recorded observations, plant species, animal behaviours, weather patterns, and river conditions. They sketched maps and measured distances with chains and sextants. They weren't just exploring, they were documenting the new American frontier. The Corps passed through lands occupied by numerous Native American tribes, people who had lived there for generations and knew the rivers and plains intimately. The expedition's first major interaction came with the Otto and Missouri tribes near present-day Nebraska. The meeting was formal, diplomatic, and crucial. Clark presented gifts and medals, while Lewis explained the United States' new claims over the territory, a concept that many native leaders viewed with skepticism. Still, diplomacy prevailed for now. The Corps pressed on. Wildlife became both a marvel and a threat. Grizzly bears, previously unknown to the Americans, proved far more aggressive than anticipated. Swarms of gnats and mosquitoes tormented the men relentlessly. Bison herds thundered across the plains. Prairie dogs, never before seen by Easterners, amazed Lewis so much he tried to ship one back to Jefferson alive. By October 1804, after 5 grueling months on the river, they reached the Mandan and Hidatsa villages in present-day North Dakota. There, as snow began to fall and the Missouri iced over, the Corps built Fort Mandan and prepared to spend the winter among the tribes. They had come hundreds of miles, but the hardest part of their journey still lay ahead. The Rocky Mountains were waiting, and so was the vast unknown beyond. As the Missouri River froze and the snow deepened, the Corps of Discovery settled into winter at Fort Mandan, a crude but sturdy log structure built near the villages of the Mandan and Hidatsa tribes. It was now late 1804, and temperatures plunged well below zero. The men spent the season repairing gear, restocking provisions, and interacting with the local tribes, whose hospitality and knowledge would prove invaluable. The Mandan and Hidatsa were experienced traders and farmers. Their villages bustled with activity even in the heart of winter, and their generosity helped the Corps survive. The two tribes also had something even more valuable than food: intelligence. They spoke of mountains ahead, of distant rivers, and of a mysterious tribe called the Shoshone, who lived near the western edge of the known world. A tribe Lewis and Clark desperately needed to find, because if there was any hope of crossing the Rockies and reaching the Pacific, they would need horses, and the Shoshone were known to have them. And this is where Sacagawea enters the story. During their stay, Lewis and Clark hired a French-Canadian fur trapper named Toussaint Charbonneau as an interpreter. He came with his young wife, a Shoshone woman named Sacagawea, who had been kidnapped as a child and sold to Charbonneau. Though still a teenager and pregnant at the time, Sacagawea quickly proved far more than just the trapper's wife. In February 1805, she gave birth to a son, Jean-Baptiste, nicknamed Pomp by Clark. And just 2 months later, with her infant slung on her back, Sacagawea set off with the Corps as they resumed their westward journey. Her presence transformed the expedition. First, she was an interpreter, able to communicate with Shoshone bands they would later encounter. Second, she knew some of the terrain ahead. And third, perhaps most importantly, she was a symbol. A woman carrying a baby signalled peace to the tribes they met along the way. War parties didn't bring families. The Corps of Discovery left Fort Mandan in April 1805 with stronger supplies, better maps, and a new hope. Ahead lay roaring rivers, towering mountains, and challenges none of them had faced before. But now they had Sacagawea, a quiet force who would shape the fate of their mission. As the Corps of Discovery pushed deeper into the continent in spring 1805, the Missouri River began to change. The once wide and muddy current narrowed, twisted through rocky valleys, and grew more turbulent. The land around them was no longer gentle prairie. It was rising, rugged, and wild. The expedition was entering the upper Missouri Basin, and the terrain was turning against them. They soon encountered one of their most daunting physical challenges, the Great Falls of the Missouri. Instead of the single waterfall Lewis had anticipated, they faced a series of 5, a 21-mile obstacle of rapids and cascades. The Corps had to carry boats and supplies across dry land in a brutal portage. It took over a month of exhausting labour. The men hauled tons of cargo across prickly pear cactus fields and swarms of biting insects, all while dragging hulking boats over rolling terrain with makeshift wheels. Despite the hardship, the portage was also a turning point. The falls confirmed that the expedition was on the right track. Native accounts had mentioned the falls, and reaching them proved that the fabled Northwest Passage, if it existed, might lie just beyond. But the river didn't lead them to an easy route west. Instead, it led them straight into the Rocky Mountains. By August 1805, the Corps had reached the three forks of the Missouri, where the river splits into the Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin. They followed the Jefferson River, tracing Sacagawea's childhood memories in hopes of finding her people. Soon, they encountered a small group of Shoshone, and in an extraordinary twist of fate, the chief turned out to be Sacagawea's own brother, Camorwait. The emotional reunion couldn't have come at a better time. Through Sacagawea and the newly gained trust of her tribe, the Corps secured horses and guides, essential for the next leg of the journey. The dream of a water route to the Pacific was fading, but with horses and Shoshone support, crossing the Rockies was now possible. The river had brought them far, but now it was the mountains that would test them. And the next few weeks would prove to be the most grueling of the entire expedition. With Shoshone horses now secured, and the dream of a northwest passage by water officially dead, the Corps of Discovery faced their next and most grueling ordeal. Crossing the Bitterroot Mountains, a snow-cloaked range in western Montana and Idaho that made the Rockies look merciful. This was not exploration anymore. This was survival. Guided by the Shoshone and later the Nez Perce, Lewis and Clark led their men into the high passes of the Bitterroots in September 1805, right as early snowstorms began to hit. The path was a nightmare, steep, narrow, and blanketed with snow. The men slipped along icy trails, their hands and faces cracked from cold. They had no game to hunt. Their horses were collapsing from starvation, and the men were reduced to eating candles, soup made from animal hides, and whatever roots they could scavenge. At times they could barely move a mile per day. By the time they descended into Nez Perce territory, the Corps was on the brink of collapse. They were emaciated, exhausted, and barely alive. The Nez Perce could have attacked them. They had the numbers and the element of surprise. But instead, the tribe chose mercy. The Nez Perce fed the men dried salmon and camas root and helped them recover. It was a pivotal moment. Without the Nez Perce, the expedition might have died right there, buried in a mountain pass. Once they recovered, Lewis and Clark cached their horses and built new dugout canoes. The rivers, now the Clearwater, the Snake, and eventually the mighty Columbia, would carry them the rest of the way to the Pacific. But they knew something now that they hadn't known at the start. There was no direct water route across the continent. The Northwest Passage that generations of explorers had hoped for simply didn't exist. The mountains cut the continent in half. Still, they had made it across. The Corps pressed on, racing against the coming winter, braving new rivers and new dangers. But spirits were rising again. They had endured the worst nature could throw at them, and the smell of the ocean was no longer a fantasy. It was real. And just ahead. Chapter 7. Reaching the Pacific. In October 1805, after months of hardship, the Corps of Discovery emerged from the wild interior and began their descent down the Columbia River, a waterway that would lead them, finally, to the Pacific Ocean. For the first time in over a year, they were travelling downstream. The land was changing. The air was wetter, the forests denser, and the rivers teemed with salmon. But it wasn't smooth sailing. The Columbia, though majestic, was treacherous. Rapids, whirlpools, and jagged rocks made navigation dangerous. One wrong move could smash a canoe and send supplies, or men, to the bottom. Several boats capsized, equipment was lost, yet the Corps pressed on, driven by something stronger than fear, the nearness of their goal. Along the way, they passed through lands inhabited by powerful and populous tribes, the Walla Walla, the Yakima, the Chinook, and others. Trade and diplomacy continued. In some cases, tensions rose, especially when tribal customs clashed with the Corps' military discipline. But no battles broke out, and many tribes offered fish, roots, and information in exchange for trinkets, knives, or Jefferson's silver peace medals. Then, in mid-November 1805, they saw it. The Pacific Ocean. Or more precisely, they saw the Columbia River's estuary, churning with tidal waves and storm winds. Clark wrote in his journal, "Ocean in view. Oh, the joy." They had made it. After more than 4,000 miles, across rivers, plains and mountains, the cause of discovery had reached the far western edge of the continent. But the Pacific didn't exactly roll out a red carpet. The cause arrived just in time for a miserable coastal winter. Rain fell for weeks, winds howled, supplies were low. The men were cold and soaked. Food was harder to find than expected, and trading with local tribes proved complicated. The Corps voted, including Sacagawea and Clark's black slave York, on where to spend the winter, eventually selecting a sheltered spot south of the river. There they built Fort Clatsop, near modern-day Astoria, Oregon. They would remain there for the next 4 months, documenting coastal wildlife, crafting maps, and preparing for the long journey home. The mission was half over, but the most perilous part still lay ahead. Getting back. Alive. In March 1806, after 4 soggy, bone-chilling months at Fort Clatsop, the Corps of Discovery packed their gear, burned what they couldn't carry, and turned eastward. They had made it to the Pacific, but getting home would be no victory lap. The return trip was every bit as challenging as the journey west. Their supplies were low, their clothes were worn to rags, and the spring rains turned trails to mud. Once again, they relied on the generosity of native tribes to survive, including the Clatsop, Nez Perce, and Walla Walla, trading what few items they had left for food, horses, and directions. Recrossing the Bitterroot Mountains was as miserable as the first time. Snow still covered the high passes, and game was scarce. The men were thinner, hungrier, and more weathered, but more experienced too. What had once been blind guesswork was now guided instinct. After crossing the divide, Lewis and Clark split the Corps into 2 groups to explore more territory on the return. Lewis went north toward the Marias River, hoping to better define the northern boundary of the Louisiana Purchase. His group encountered hostile Blackfeet warriors, leading to the only violent conflict of the entire expedition. 2 young Blackfeet were killed in a skirmish after attempting to steal guns and horses. Clark's group, meanwhile, followed the Yellowstone River, carving new routes and naming landmarks, including the famous Pompey's Pillar, which still bears Clark's name etched into the rock. By late summer 1806, the 2 groups reunited near the Missouri River. Spirits were high. The land now seemed smaller. Landmarks once unfamiliar were now old friends. When they reached the settled edge of Missouri, news spread quickly. They had made it back alive. The Corps returned to St. Louis on September 23, 1806, greeted like heroes. They had been gone over 2 years. Many had assumed they were dead. But they returned with maps, journals, 178 new plant and animal species, and detailed information about dozens of native tribes. They had crossed the continent, and more importantly, proved it could be done. For a young nation still finding its identity, the return of Lewis and Clark wasn't just the end of a journey, it was the beginning of a frontier. The return of the Corps of Discovery marked the end of an epic journey, but also the beginning of its legacy. Lewis and Clark were hailed as national heroes. Their journals were praised. Their maps became the foundation of American westward expansion. They had not found a continuous water route to the Pacific, but what they brought back was far more valuable, a clear picture of the vast, rich, and complex American West. President Jefferson was thrilled. The expedition had fulfilled its mission, and then some. The scientific specimens alone were astonishing. Plants, animals, fossils, even live animals like prairie dogs and magpies were sent to Washington. The detailed accounts of native nations, their customs, languages, and political structures became essential reading for future explorers and policymakers. But for Lewis and Clark, the story didn't end so cleanly. William Clark went on to a long public career. He became governor of the Missouri Territory and superintendent of Indian Affairs. He raised Sacagawea's son, Jean-Baptiste, nicknamed Pomp, and continued to engage with native tribes throughout his life, sometimes as a friend, other times as an enforcer of U.S. expansion. Meriwether Lewis, however, struggled. Appointed governor of the Louisiana Territory, he was plagued by political conflict, debt, and declining mental health. Just 3 years after the expedition, in 1809, Lewis died under mysterious circumstances, likely suicide, along the Natchez Trace in Tennessee. He was only 35. As for Sacagawea, her life after the expedition remains partly veiled in uncertainty. Records suggest she died young, in 1812, though some oral traditions claim she lived much longer. What's clear is that her presence was essential. Without her, the Corps might never have made it through the Rockies or gained the trust of key tribes. Her strength, endurance, and quiet intelligence changed the fate of the expedition, even if the history books didn't always give her full credit. The Corps of Discovery reshaped how Americans saw their country. They showed that the continent was vast, interconnected, and already inhabited by diverse sovereign nations. They opened a door that would soon flood with settlers, soldiers, and ambition. Lewis and Clark didn't just explore new land. They stood at the edge of something far larger, the future of the United States, and it would never be the same. Beneath the thundering footsteps of tourists and the humming life of Istanbul, there lies a world carved in silence. A world that once kept the Byzantine Empire alive, drop by drop. It's called the Basilica Cistern, and if you didn't know to look for it, you might never suspect that under the cobbled streets and clatter of modern life, an ancient cathedral of water still breathes. Built in the 6th century, during the reign of Emperor Justinian the Fair, the cistern is more than a storage tank. It is a palace turned inward. Measuring over 9,800 square meters, it held up to 80,000 cubic meters of water, all hidden beneath the city's foundations. But this wasn't just a pit. This was architecture, elegance, a subterranean marvel crafted with vision and purpose. Justinian ordered its construction following a catastrophic fire and series of rebellions that shook the city. His empire, already scarred by plague and riots, could not afford water shortages, not for its palaces, its public baths, or its citizens. The cistern was meant to ensure survival, to offer Constantinople a secret wellspring in times of siege and uncertainty. But perhaps what makes the Basilica Cistern most breathtaking isn't its scale, it's its style. 336 marble columns, each around 9 meters tall, support the arched ceiling like silent sentinels. Many were repurposed, stolen, some might say, from older pagan temples. Their styles don't quite match, hinting at the improvisation and urgency that accompanied their installation. As you descend the stone staircase and enter the chamber, the temperature cools. Moisture clings to the air. The surface of the water ripples quietly beneath wooden walkways. And all around you, shadows dance across columns bathed in amber light. This was never meant to be seen. Yet it was built with such reverence for form that it rivals any above-ground basilica in grandeur. It's an upside-down cathedral designed not to praise the heavens, but to hold the earth's most essential gift. Above, centuries of war, empire, and religion shifted. But below, in the stillness, in the darkness, the Basilica Cistern waited, hidden, preserved, and ready to be rediscovered by a world that had forgotten what lay beneath its feet. In the heart of ancient Constantinople, water wasn't just a necessity. It was strategy, survival, and sovereignty. The Basilica Cistern was not the city's only reservoir, but it was among the largest and most crucial. Designed to serve the great palace of Constantinople, it was fed by aqueducts stretching miles from distant springs in the Belgrade forest, including the monumental Valens Aqueduct. The city's population was enormous for its time, hundreds of thousands, all demanding fresh water not just for drinking, but for public baths, fountains, and even imperial gardens. During times of peace, water flowed freely through the city's intricate systems. But Constantinople was a fortress as much as it was a metropolis, and siege was always a looming threat. The cistern's genius lay in its invisibility. While invaders could cut off aqueducts or poison external wells, They couldn't touch what they didn't know was there. Hidden beneath a nondescript building, once a basilica, hence the name, the cistern acted as a secret reservoir, supplying the palace complex and surrounding districts even when war battered the city's walls. Its construction was a feat of both engineering and manpower. Thousands of slaves, labourers and artisans worked under imperial orders. Materials were recycled from across the empire, particularly from temples in Asia Minor. That's why, when walking through the columns, some are ornately fluted, others plain, and still others oddly mismatched. They were borrowed, repurposed, and given new life in the service of empire. Though its function was purely practical, its design is undeniably beautiful. Light filters down in golden shafts. The columns disappear into still, dark water. The silence is broken only by the gentle lapping of droplets falling from the ceiling. Visitors today describe it as otherworldly, haunting, elegant, like a cathedral built for ghosts. Over the centuries, as empires fell and others rose, the basilica cistern slowly faded from public memory. Covered over, forgotten, and eventually left off maps entirely, it became one of the city's hidden arteries, still holding water, still doing its job, long after its creators had turned to dust. Few places embody Constantinople's quiet genius, better than this underground sea. It wasn't just architecture. It was defiance made of stone, water preserved beneath a burning, crumbling world. For centuries, the basilica cistern was forgotten, not destroyed, not ruined, simply hidden. As the Byzantine Empire crumbled and the Ottoman Empire rose, the city transformed. Churches became mosques, palaces were rebuilt, streets shifted, and names changed. But the cistern remained, quietly collecting water beneath it all, shrouded in darkness and silence. By the time the Ottomans conquered Constantinople in 1453, the cistern had already faded from collective memory. The Ottomans, brilliant architects themselves, had their own systems for water management. They rarely used the older Byzantine cisterns, considering them relics of another time. And so, the basilica cistern fell into obscurity, not demolished, just ignored. Yet, as is often the case with buried wonders, it couldn't stay hidden forever. Stories began to circulate. Locals in Istanbul's Sultanahmet district claimed they could draw up water, and even catch fish, by lowering buckets into holes in their basements. Some told of eerie echoes and voices coming from underground. Others swore their cellars stayed unnaturally cool, even in the sweltering summer. Curiosity stirred. It wasn't until 1545, nearly 1,000 years after its construction, that the cistern was formally rediscovered. A scholar named Petrus Gillius, working on topographical studies of the ancient city, listened to local rumours and investigated. Entering a private home, he descended by torchlight into the darkness. And there it was, a vast, echoing chamber of water and stone, perfectly preserved beneath the earth. He described the space in awe, columns disappearing into the darkness, fish gliding through silent water, and the occasional faint ripple from above. His writings reintroduced the cistern to the world, and slowly its legend resurfaced. Yet even after its rediscovery, the cistern remained mostly neglected. Locals occasionally used it as a well or a fishery, but it wasn't restored, lit, or open to the public. For centuries more, it remained the domain of shadows and whispers. It wasn't until the 20th century, with modern archaeology, tourism, and restoration, that the basilica cistern emerged once more as a wonder of Istanbul. But in that long sleep, sealed beneath a living city, it gathered something precious, mystique. And in that mystique, it became something more than a reservoir. It became a legend. Walking into the basilica cistern feels like stepping into a forgotten world, one where time hangs in the air like mist, and every sound is swallowed by stone. The moment your foot hits the wooden walkway, you're surrounded by 336 marble columns, rising from dark water like a forest carved by forgotten hands. Each one stands nearly 9 meters tall, supporting the vaulted brick ceiling above like ancient titans holding up the earth. But these columns weren't made for the cistern. They were recycled, pulled from abandoned temples, palaces, and forgotten ruins across the empire. Roman, Greek, and even pagan craftsmanship converged underground, making the cistern a kind of mosaic, not of colour, but of cultures. Some columns are smooth and plain. Others are ornately fluted, topped with Corinthian capitals. A few are chipped or asymmetrical, revealing their second-hand nature. It's as if each one carries its own forgotten story, divorced from its origin, reborn to hold water instead of gods. The ceiling, made of brick and mortar, forms a web of silent arches. The architecture is functional, yet awe-inspiring. The scale is almost spiritual. The air is cool, damp, and heavy with centuries. Light glimmers on the water's surface, reflecting the pillars and arches in shifting, hypnotic patterns. You can hear water drip from the ceiling, a gentle rhythm that echoes off stone and whispers into the cavern. Beneath the walkways, carp swim lazily through black water, descendants of those introduced long ago. They are the only living souls who've never left. There's a reverence here, not in the religious sense, but in the weight of time. You are surrounded by columns stolen from temples, set by the hands of slaves, forgotten by empires, and now carefully lit for modern eyes. The space is quiet, not because it must be, but because people instinctively fall silent, as if the cistern itself demands respect. This isn't just a ruin, it's a living memory of Roman grandeur, Byzantine pragmatism, Ottoman indifference, and modern wonder. The columns don't just hold the ceiling, they hold history, they hold silence, they hold the space between the ancient and the now, and ask nothing of you except that you listen. Tucked away in the far northwest corner of the cistern, past rows of shadowed columns and flickering reflections, lie two of the most mysterious and iconic elements of the basilica cistern, the Medusa heads. These massive stone carvings serve as the bases of two columns, their origins unknown, their purpose debated, and their expressions forever frozen in stone. The first Medusa head lies on its side, supporting a column as though casually discarded. The second is even stranger, upside down, her serpent hair hanging downward into the dampness, her face eerily calm. No plaque explains them. No inscription reveals their source. They simply are. Where did they come from? Most scholars believe they were brought from a late Roman temple, possibly dedicated to the goddess Athena, and reused as convenient building material. Another example of Justinian's empire repurposing its past. But the fact that two identical mythological figures were chosen, both hidden in a dark corner of the cistern, suggests something more than random recycling. Medusa, in Greek mythology, was a gorgon, a creature with snakes for hair whose gaze could turn men to stone. Symbolically, her image was often used as a form of protection, carved on doorways, shields, and floors to ward off evil. Could this be why she was placed here? A protective talisman beneath the surface, guarding the lifeblood of the city? Or is it something more political? Some historians argue that placing Medusa upside down or on her side was a symbolic gesture, a rejection of pagan power in favour of Christian rule, as if to say, the old gods are underfoot now, silent, powerless, but nothing is confirmed. And that's what makes them powerful. The dim lighting that falls on their faces, the sound of dripping water around them, and the way they rest under centuries of weight. It all creates a feeling that they are watching, not malevolent, not angry, just present. They are the unexplained echo in an otherwise orderly space. You come for the columns, you stay for the stillness, but it's the Medusa heads, silent, strange, and submerged, that haunt your thoughts long after you've gone. The basilica cistern is more than an architectural marvel. It is an experience of senses slowed. Step inside, and the modern world blurs. Your eyes adjust to the dim amber glow. Your ears catch the echo of a single droplet falling from the vaulted ceiling. And suddenly, you're no longer in Istanbul. You're in a space where light, sound, and time drift differently. Sound behaves oddly here. Footsteps don't echo in the usual way. They ripple, bouncing softly off wet stone. Conversations are hushed, not out of etiquette, but instinct. The weight of centuries presses down. Even the fish seem to swim quietly, as if they too respect the silence. Then there's the light. During the day, a few natural shafts filter down from above, pale sunbeams that pierce the gloom like searchlights from another world. At night, or in the deeper corners, modern lighting casts dramatic shadows across the columns, highlighting their rough textures and mismatched forms. Every twist of perspective reveals something new. A different column base, a change in ceiling height, the glint of moisture on a stone face. The still, dark water, only a few feet deep now, becomes a mirror. It reflects the columns above, doubling the height of the space and turning the cistern into a hall of illusions. At times, it's hard to tell where the stone ends and its reflection begins. The surface is occasionally broken by the gentle ripple of a fish or the fall of a droplet, as if the cistern is breathing. Slow, calm, ancient. In modern times, artists and musicians have been drawn here to perform. Its acoustics are unmatched. The hum of a single cello, the slow chant of a voice, becomes otherworldly. The cistern doesn't just echo. It holds sound, like it holds water, long after it's been made. But even without music, the space feels alive. Not haunted, but aware. Every arch feels like a gateway. Every column, a sentinel. Every sound, a whisper from another era. The basilica cistern isn't just something to see, it's something to feel. A sacred pause beneath the noise of a city. A place where shadow becomes story, and silence becomes a kind of song. For centuries, the basilica cistern existed in the margins, a practical space built for survival, later forgotten and then rediscovered. But in the modern age, it has become something entirely different, a symbol of Istanbul's layered identity, a blend of empire and myth, water and stone, east and west. Restoration efforts began seriously in the 1980s, as interest in preserving Istanbul's ancient wonders grew. The cistern had suffered neglect, flooding, and occasional misuse, even serving at times as a dumping ground or illegal fishery. But conservation teams drained the water, reinforced crumbling columns, and installed wooden walkways and subtle lighting. By 1987, it was officially reopened to the public. Tourists began to trickle in, then flood in. What had once been invisible beneath the surface of the city became one of Istanbul's most visited landmarks. Travel magazines marvelled at it. Photographers sought its shadows. Writers found metaphors in its stillness. Directors, of course, saw something else entirely. Atmosphere. The basilica cistern soon became a cinematic backdrop, lending its haunting ambience to everything from documentaries to blockbusters. Most famously, it appeared in the James Bond film From Russia with Love, 1963, where 007 rows a small boat between the columns beneath Istanbul. More recently, it was featured in Inferno, 2016, adapted from Dan Brown's thriller, turning the ancient reservoir into a stage for modern suspense. But the cistern is more than a film set. It is a mirror of Istanbul itself, a city constantly built atop its own past. Churches beneath mosques, palaces beside skyscrapers, history underfoot. The cistern reminds us that even beneath our everyday lives, the remnants of great civilizations remain, waiting patiently, hidden just beneath the surface. Its transformation from utility to icon is part of what gives it power. It no longer holds water for emperors, but it holds meaning, for locals, for travellers, for artists. It connects the present to the past without words or ceremony. A place once built in secrecy now draws the world to whisper its name. It is no longer just a cistern. It is a threshold to mystery, memory, and the unseen heart of a city that refuses to forget. Walking through the Basilica Cistern today, it's easy to forget how fragile it once was, how close it came to being lost entirely. The structure has no lavish entrance, no towering facade. It was never meant to dazzle. It was meant to disappear. And yet, it has survived earthquakes, invasions, neglect, and the unyielding march of time. But survival doesn't happen by accident. The cistern owes its preservation to a series of quiet guardians, not emperors or generals, but engineers, scholars, and curious locals who refused to let it fade. During the Ottoman period, it was unofficially maintained by residents who accessed it through wells and cellars. They may not have known its full scale, but they valued what it offered: cold, clean water, and perhaps a sense of mystery beneath their homes. In the 19th and 20th centuries, scholars like Petrus Gillius and later Turkish archaeologists began documenting the cistern in earnest. They mapped its columns, traced the origin of its marble, and began asking the questions that turned it from a hidden space into a subject of fascination. Their quiet dedication became the first steps toward restoration. And in modern times, it's the caretakers, guides, and preservationists who guard it now, maintaining its structure, balancing humidity, controlling algae, and ensuring visitors walk safely on suspended walkways. The still water must be managed. The columns must be monitored. Even the light must be delicately balanced. Too much, and it shatters the mood. Too little, and the past slips back into shadow. It is also guarded by storytellers, those who share its history, who translate the silence into meaning. Every guide, every documentary, every quiet traveller who lingers a moment longer in front of the Medusa heads, they too become keepers of the cistern. And let's not forget the locals, Istanbulites who grew up hearing tales of fish in basement wells, of shadowy stone rooms beneath the city. For them, the cistern is not just a tourist site, it is a neighbour, a legend they've always known was just below the surface. So while the empires above have fallen and the palaces they served are now museums, the Basilica Cistern endures, not because it demanded attention, but because generations refused to let it be forgotten. Not all guardians carry swords. Some carry flashlights, notebooks, or simply respect. The Basilica Cistern is more than stone and water. It is memory suspended in silence. Beneath the pulse of modern Istanbul, it remains untouched by the rush of taxis, the clang of tram bells, or the call to prayer ringing out above. Here, everything slows. You do not visit the cistern so much as descend into it, as if entering a dream whispered by the earth itself. Its true power lies in its stillness. Nothing here is loud. Nothing insists. The columns don't shout. The arches don't boast. The Medusa heads don't explain themselves. And yet, everything speaks, softly, patiently, if you know how to listen. The water mirrors the ceiling. The ceiling mirrors time. You begin to wonder if the place is really underground, or just outside the edge of reality. This isn't the kind of monument that celebrates conquest or faith. It doesn't have golden domes or mosaic saints. It simply endures. Its beauty is in how it refuses to vanish, how it turns the practical into the poetic. Built to hold water, it now holds wonder. Each visitor leaves with something different. For some, it's awe, that a structure so ancient could still be so intact. For others, it's tranquility, a moment of escape from the chaos above. And for many, it's mystery. Why were the Medusa heads placed that way? Who shaped these columns? How many forgotten hands laboured in silence to build this place that still breathes today? As the tour ends and you climb the steps back toward daylight, the spell doesn't quite break. You emerge into the sound of cars and footsteps, into sunshine and the smell of roasted chestnuts. But part of you stays behind. Part of you still hears the dripping water, still sees the flicker of gold light on ancient stone. The Basilica Cistern is not just a relic. It is a reminder. that beneath every empire, every city, every story, there is something deeper, something older, something waiting in the dark. Still waters run deep, they say, and in the heart of Istanbul, they echo forever.